Science Week is sort of the invention of me and Trish. It's a way for Under the Jungle to give back to the community and to offer unique opportunities for our former students to participate in citizen science and assist in actual cutting-edge science with cutting-edge technology.
Over the last 6+ years, I've been working pretty intensively to develop open source instruments that are accessible for researchers to create data logging platforms that are power optimized, and they're built on AA batteries, Arduino microcontroller boards, and really hardware store PVC. One of the things that's come out of that is that we have now a very long-term monitoring network here in the Yucatan Peninsula. The project is called the Cave Pearl Project, and one of the keystone instruments, one of the 16 different variants, is a flow meter, which gets attached to the cave ceiling, and inside the body is an accelerometer, which measures how much tilt there is on the instrument. And by having dozens of these in a number of key sites throughout the region, as the water flows in one direction or the other, we get long-term data.
And that data is really great, but it only has directionality and angle. So it rotates in the cave, which is cool, but doesn't tell you things like how much water was traveling through the cave system.
How do you go from a long-term time series to the volume of water flowing through the system?
And so what we came to do this year is to calibrate those sensors with something more fancy.
So I remember maybe 2 years ago, I asked you, Trish, what would be the craziest, coolest thing we could do that would help you with the group? And you were like, Natalie, what I really want to do is construct a net or a grid across the cave, and then we're going to go in with this machine that doesn't exist yet, and we're going to go and measure the speed of the water traveling through the cave across 20 points, and we're going to do this over and over again through a tidal cycle. But I don't know if we can do that. I don't know if that's possible. It's kind of crazy. And I was like, no, we can do it. Let's do it.
So imagine you have a cave. And so you're looking into the cave. And in the cave is hanging one of these flow meters. And as the water is flowing, it is tilted forwards or backwards by the force of the water against it. That gives us the long term. But it is only at that one point in time. So we get the time series where the water flow is going up and down, and maybe there's a hurricane and it comes down. To go from this time series to see what is the volume of water, we have gone in and put in poles, which we then have to measure the point flows at a number of different depths down each one of the poles. And then what we can do, what I do, is I can take this matrix of measurements and I can look at how much water flow is going through. But by measuring the area of the high flow and multiplying it out proportionally by the total cave, it is possible to say when the flow tilt meter is at this point, we may have 25 cubic feet per second flowing through the cave. This is the first place in the world that I think that this has ever been undertaken. You know, if you're in Australia or Italy or the States or Canada, even also in Mexico, surface rivers are monitored and they're discharge calibrated regularly. This, to my knowledge, is the first major undertaking in attempting to do this on a grand scale I've done some point measurements before, so I knew it was technically possible, but really going big, it is only possible with Science Week and the team effort.
The week started on Sunday, where we went into Taj, where we are recording right now, and did some method development.
A lot of it was MacGyvering at first and trying to just figure out all the equipment of what we wanted to do and planning out how we were going to go about a lot of the dives. Starting with discussing what the actual thing we are trying to study and measure, and then how we are going to get that gear down into the cave and then set it up and get out safely.
So, like, you had the idea, like, I want to put this grid, and I think originally we were talking about, you know, we could drill permanent, like, eye hooks into the cave, and then there's Natalie, the cave diver. No, we're not drilling into the caves here, we can't do that, it needs to be removable. And so I came up with the idea of just floating the top of the pole and weighting the bottom of the pole, but we were actually talking about strings at the beginning. So when Science Week started, my vision was we're doing this on a string, but then we had Steph, who's an engineer, came in and said, no, the thing's gonna rotate. So Steph had the idea of using poles.
So we were able to repurpose a decent amount of the gear that Trish brought for the flow meters and instead use it for the discharge calibration. It was already clearly tested and has a lot of validation behind it, so we knew it would be reliable and it had the structure that we would need. We needed to be able to mount a sensor across the entire cross-section of a cave and be able to do that repeatably across multiple runs, and that means we needed a structure that was very stable and could remain in place. So for that part, we took the flow meter poles and essentially created almost like a tent pole structure with a lift bag at the top and the weights on the bottom.
Wilson! This thing is our sensor that we have. We've affectionately named this one Anglerfish. It's A.
They were named A and B. That's so boring. So we we decided to name them Anglerfish and Blobfish. Yeah.
On the top here, there's a long cable that we use, and this is the sensor head. So we screw a homemade at the dive shop attachment to some poles, and we attach it with clothespins to these poles and just leave it. And so it took that.
Ugh, and it's heavy on land.
It has 8 pounds of lead. That one has 8 pounds of lead in it.
Who set up the lead?
Lexi.
So my job was to get the units slightly negative, but fairly neutral, so they wouldn't be a drag, literally, to bring through the water. And Ed, when he designed the interior, he 3D printed a sled for us to attach the lead to, and that worked really well.
Ended up using some paper to make sure that the weight sled that we have didn't move around in the water column as it swung around, and we very handily labeled it as not trash, so it doesn't get thrown away.
Yeah, but we got them pretty close, and then added some tire weights at the very end.
Lexi has a specific name she was going by during this phase of the project.
Ballast bitch. Self-appointed name.
The sensor mount that they had was really incompatible with the existing rods. So luckily, Trish had brought down some just rejected 3D printed FDM materials. And so since I knew that has, by definition of its use, a very low melting point, I was essentially able to take a heat gun and use some of the old rods that were no longer usable for flow meters and use that to create a clamp, essentially. And then the idea was that we could then mount that reliably onto the poles and use clothespins, which we were able to find in Chedraui. Chedraui trips are always fun scavenger hunts, if you like scavenger hunts. Sometimes, if you are there just to get a thing, it can be very frustrating. But essentially, we just had an idea that we need to, one, get clothespins, and 2, some way of telling what the flow in the cave is like, so that way you're always positioning the sensor directly into the flow. So the really nice coincidence is that the night before, Chedraui put out all the Christmas decorations because it's the holidays, and we were able to get a bunch of gift wrap and try that out, including adorable Baby Yoda streamers. But we also were able to find the very last bag of clothespins in the entire store of Chedraui, and that became like a really big help in the entire process. And ironically, it wasn't actually the gift wrap itself that we ended up using as the streamers, but the cellophane packaging that the streamers came in.
And this was maybe one of the most impressive things of the week, because Steph made this, she's an engineer, out of like materials around the shop, and then we looked online, and the company that sells this thing has basically the exact same product manufactured, at a high scale manufacturing level that looks just like Steph's, but Steph just made it, in half an hour.
What's really impressed me is like the number of
Insane.
times when I explain scientifically what needs to happen, and there's a face of surprise and sometimes even shock. It's like, what do you mean we're going to have a cable run from the sensor head that's now mounted on the poles using Steph's attachment to the other diver? How are we going to do that safely?
One team went and figured out how to assemble the poles, how to do the measurement inside of the cavern zone. Another team went in to figure out how you do a cross section, so you can kind of get that feeling down for different teams who are going to do different actions.
There were a lot of unique things about the Shellha location. First off, it's that the fact that it is essentially in a massive recreational park, and that causes a lot of interesting logistical issues.
We had to transport all our gear by a giant wheeled cart bicycle contraption.
This is...
Shellha is not a place that is open to the public or to cave divers. We received special permission for this scientific project. The person who helped us out is our longtime friend and contact at the parks, Ten Singh.
Para la organización de la logística, nos organizamos con los buzos técnicos, quienes van a hacer esta colocación de instrumentos, también con el área de seguridad integral, donde teníamos que ver la seguridad integral de todos. Entonces, con paramédicos, ambulancia, siempre muy importante para nosotros, es uno de nuestros valores como grupo Xcaret, seguridad ante todo.
The dive in Shellha is really unique. Shellha is a site where the fresh water from the caves flows out to meet the ocean, and it creates this brackish mixing zone in these lagoons.
I really like going to the outlets, the discharge places, because it's this, because there's sea creatures.
I had never seen mangrove jellyfish. I had only previously seen them in aquariums, and they were really tiny, and to see them in the wild was very, very cool, because there were so many different varieties and sizes that I didn't know, and sometimes they would get blown into the cave. So I would sometimes look down and there's like a jellyfish in there, which is really not something you typically see when cave diving.
In Shellha, because it's this coastal estuary, the fresh water is flowing from the cave out to the coast. And if you go down, you hit the halocline. And because we're at a relatively high sea level right now, it's pushing this vast amount of ocean water into the cave systems underneath. What it means, though, is that the water in the shallow part that's coming out of the cave at 30 centimeters per second or a foot per second is really going fast out of the cave. And if you drop down, you actually have really fast flows of the salt water going in. And there's this thin boundary.
So by playing with your depth, you can choose to like breathe it down and let it pull you in, and then whoop, up, and then whee.
Eventually, I just accepted that sometimes you're just going to have to touch the cave. Normally, we try to minimize our impact on the cave as much as possible, but with flow like that, sometimes you just have to accept that grabbing the cave with your hand is going to be way less impact than you constantly kicking and trying to stay in place. And so that resulted in some fun geckoing on the walls.
So one of the things that's really difficult is I'm filming in extreme haloclines. Some of the characteristics that Trish wants to see are haloclines, which means by nature, my shots are going to be really blurry. So you're like, how do you even try to show this? How do you shoot this? I have these weird shots of like a perfectly clear ceiling and then an entirely out of focus diver. And I have no idea what to do other than just show it as it really appears in real life.
So Trish, our resident scientist, went through and found the location that she thought was best for doing the measurements. Once Trish picked the cross section, he drew it so that when the other dive teams came in, they had an idea of what they were looking at before they got there. The second dive that happened was the setup dive. When I went in to the cave, I had this guy wrapped up and on my butt ring, and so I had to pull him out and then had to unfurl it, and then you gotta pull it upwards so that the air, when it comes up, goes up into it versus to the side or something like that. So I take my regulator that I'm not breathing off of on the long hose, I stick it up in here and I just purge, and then it fills up with air, becomes very, very positive, and so then you got to roll it up, fighting against it. Sometimes you have a little bit of air out because it can't actually roll, and then you clip it. We wanted it as high as we could, and so there was this big bag filled up against the rock. There's a pole that we attach, and then we screw in other poles to shove it down in the sediment to make the pole as vertical as we can in this cave. And then the third type of dive was actually the discharge calibration, where we went through and we took 30-ish data points.
So I was the person who would take the sensor, which we called either blobfish or anglerfish, and actually use the clamp that I designed and made and attach it to the poles. And then when the person reading the sensor was able to get a good reading, I would then go up to it and move it to the next point in the data cross-section.
My job in this was to carry the blowfish instrument clipped to me, and as the scribe, I took notes of the readings that we were getting. And then the next dive teams will continue that and on, and so that we have data from several different time fields.
If I were to give you a standard hydrogeology class, you would find in every single textbook that it says the freshwater goes from the inland, flows out to the ocean. And the salt water that's underneath that gets dragged along in the same direction. It's called entrainment. And many years ago, it was actually a key point of my PhD down here over 20 years ago. I was trying to measure this entrainment. And one of the key outcomes was that I failed, categorically failed, and put forward really robust data showing that we have decoupled flows. The fresh water and the salt water can be going in opposite directions. So basically every single hydrogeology textbook that you pick up will tell you a very different story than the reality of what we have lived through here in the last few days.
Es muy importante para nosotros la obtención de esta información y sobre todo pues asombrados por los instrumentos que se colocan dentro de estas cuevas y podemos medir las corrientes de agua y bueno, muchas cosas más. Entonces muy importante para nosotros el poder estar y participar en esto.
If the current flow rates continue as they are right now, in a site that's 2 kilometers inland from the coast, that we have 0.6 cubic meters per second, a number that doesn't make sense to a lot of people. But that's over 20 cubic feet per second. And that is in one tunnel that is only one of thousands that are draining the aquifer from the vast inland jungle out through the underground rivers and ultimately discharging, delivering this water out onto the Mesoamerican Barrier Reef system back into the ocean. If we multiply this out, that ends up being almost 20 cubic kilometers per year, or 4.5 cubic miles per year. This is a vast volume. You end up having great distances of many, many miles per day, many kilometers per day travel time. One of the implications of this is that activities and changes, and certainly nutrients and waste products that are affecting the aquifer, even at great distance inland, very quickly are transported through the system, affecting many ecosystems, the cenotes along the way, and then ultimately onto the Mesoamerican Barrier Reef system.
If I didn't get any good shots, I shot it all.
This one is. Are you recording?
Yeah. Are you sure you want me to keep that?
I actually want to see how they break because we lined them with the carbon fiber rods, right?
Sure. There you go. It took a lot of effort to break them.
Good.
Ballast bitch. Self-appointed name.
Oddly, what kind of personal pleasure do you get out of cable rowdies?
I get odd satisfaction from like delightful cable routing in my robots.
Soy buzo, tengo certificación Open Water y me encantaría ser buzo de cueva.